Welcome. It is so wonderful to have this room full of faces. Thank you for being here. My name is Bonnie. I'm an event host and also the poetry event coordinator here at Brookline Booksmith. Tonight, it's my absolute pleasure to introduce Edwin Hill in conversation with Bracken MacLeod. Before I do introductions, I do just have a few housekeeping notes. Firstly, if you pre-ordered a book and you haven't yet picked it up or you'd like to buy a copy, they'll be available for sale at the back counter over there. Secondly, please keep your phones off or on silent for the duration of the reading. This event is being live streamed on the iPad right here. Hello to YouTube. Other than the backs of a few heads in the front row, our audience isn't visible to YouTube, but if you don't want to be live on YouTube, just avoid standing in front of it and you'll be okay. No, well, follow your heart. And finally, we will, of course, have a Q&A at the end of the event, so get your questions ready to go, but hold them to the end. And now, for the fun part, it is my pleasure to introduce our authors and tell you a bit about the wonderful book we are here to celebrate. Our conversation partner tonight is Bracken MacLeod. He is the Bram Stoker and Shirley Jackson Award-nominated author of the novels Mountain Home, Come to Dust, Stranded, and most recently, Closing Costs, which Publishers Weekly hailed as a masterly job combining horror and suspense. You can find his short fiction in places like Lamplight, Thuglit, and Splatterpunk, among many others, as well as in his two collections of short fiction, 13 Views of the Suicide Woods and White Night and Other Pawns. Before devoting himself full-time to writing, he worked as a civil and criminal litigator, a university philosophy instructor, and a martial arts teacher. He now lives in the Metro West area with his wife and son, where he is at work on his next book. Thank you, Bracken, so much for joining us tonight. And of course, tonight's author, Edwin Hill, is the critically acclaimed author of 5 novels, including the popular Hester Thursby series. He's been nominated for Edgar and Agatha Awards, featured in Us magazine, received star reviews in Publishers Weekly, Booklist, and Library Journal, and was recognized as one of 6 crime writers to watch in Mystery Scene magazine. Born in Duxbury, he attended Wesleyan University and after graduation headed west to San Francisco. Later, he returned to Boston and earned an MFA from Emerson College, and he switched gears to work in educational publishing. For many years, he served as the vice president and editorial director for Bedford St. Martin's, a division of Macmillan Learning, before turning to writing full-time. You can find his work in the LA Review of Books, The Life Sentence, Publishers Weekly, and Ellery Queen Mystery Magazine, among others. He currently lives in Roslindale, Massachusetts with his partner and their lab, Edith Ann. Congratulations, Edwin, on the release of Who to Believe. And of course, to tell you all a bit about this wonderful book, Who to Believe takes place in a small Massachusetts town, once a small community of whalers and farmers, and now your classic well-to-do town with gossiping citizens and their complicated relations. However, when restaurateur Laurel Thibodeau is found brutally murdered in her home, the town's rumor mill begins to churn even more. Suspicion naturally falls on her husband, who had gambling debts that only a life insurance policy could fix. But there are other rumors too. A group of 6 friends gather for Alice Stone's 40th birthday, and their theories abound concerning Laurel's death. Max Barbosa, the chief of police, has heard plenty of them, and has his longtime friend, Unitarian minister Georgia Fitzhugh. Local psychiatrist Farley Drake is privy to even more, gleaning snippets of gossip and information from his patients while closely guarding his own past. And we soon discover that maybe everyone has something to hide. Because before this late summer evening party comes to a close, one of the 6 will be dead. And as jealousy, revenge, adultery, and greed converge, the question becomes not who among these friends might be capable of such a thing, but who isn't. In a starred review, Kirkus Reviews called the book a devilishly clever delight that keeps readers perennially off kilter. We're so excited to hear you both talk about it. Everyone, please give a warm welcome to Edwin and Bracken.
So the book is, we were originally, do we need amplification? Can you hear us?
Really want this? Oh yeah, I suppose it's better for YouTube. Okay. Since we were supposed to do this in January. The book has been out for 3 weeks now. You've all read it, right? And we can talk about all the spoilers in the book. No? All right, okay. I'll try to do my best not to spoil anything. You know, when they first asked me to interview you for this book, of course I said yes. No questions asked, because we've been friends for a couple of decades now. But I had no idea how hard it was going to be, because this book is so full of twists and reveals and shifts and points of view that talking about it without spoiling it is really hard. So we're going to do our best. I'm going to let you be the guide for what to reveal and what not to reveal. But it reminded me of a thing. Trying to talk about this book is kind of like trying to talk about how to bake a pie without giving away what's in it. But as Carl Sagan said, if you want to make a pie from scratch, first you must invent the universe. So let's talk about inventing the universe. Starting broad. This story is about as complicated as they come, yet it reads real effortlessly to me, like, you know, in the way that complicated books should. You know, if you're the reader, it's no work. Which says to me that the writer did a tremendous amount of work. So let's talk a little bit about the process. How did you put together this book in particular? And is it a departure from your usual style of constructing a narrative?
I'm sure.
No.
Okay, oh yes, there it is. There's my voice, my lovely voice. Thanks everyone for coming tonight. I really appreciate it. This is my 5th time doing this. I see a lot of people who have shown up every single time, and I cannot tell you how much I appreciate that. So this was a big departure for me. All of my other novels, my 4 other novels were straight 3-act stories, beginning, middle, and end. I used multiple personalities. No, that's me. I used multiple narrators, but I did it in a traditional way, where it'd be one chapter from one narrator, second chapter from a second narrator, so on. For this one, I really wanted to try something new with the structure. So it's a very highly structured novel. I used a structure which is called a Rashomon, which is based on a Japanese movie called Rashomon, where you tell the experience through many different lenses. And so Joan would tell her story of being at this reading tonight, and then Denise would tell her experience of being at this reading tonight, and then Jennifer would tell her story, and it might be slightly different because we all experience things differently. And so so that was the structure I used. It was complicated, but I did a lot more planning than I normally do for a novel, and if I hadn't, I would have gone berserk.
Are you normally an outliner?
Oh, an outliner? No.
No, so you're I mean, what's technically called a discovery writer, but most people call it pantsing. You do it
Yeah.
to see your pants.
I do sort of like a middle. I do
Yeah.
sort of a little bit of each. So I think Dennis Lehane says he knows A, M, and Z when he starts a novel, but he doesn't know the other letters. And that's about what I do. I sort of know the beginning, the very midpoint, and then the end. With this one, I had to know more.
Gotcha. What was it about Rashomon in particular that made you want to try that style of storytelling?
Well, I mean, I like to sound highbrow, so I mentioned Rashomon, but I really love this show called The Affair. Have people seen The Affair? So I love The Affair, and so I just loved the way that was constructed, and I loved I love the tone of that show. So The Affair, for anyone who hasn't seen it, it's about an affair. It's about 2 people who are married and they have an affair. There's Noah and Allison. And especially early on in this series, the first half of the episode would be from Noah's point of view, the second half would be from Allison's point of view. And they'd be really different. They'd show different parts of the story, but even their perception of the same scenes would be different. Like Allison would be wearing different clothes when she was telling the story versus when Noah was telling the story. So I really loved that. And then there was this totally trashy show on Netflix called Clickbait. Did anyone watch that?
Yes.
Yeah, I loved it. And so I kept thinking to myself, I want to write something that can be turned into a TV series. So whatever, so I was like, okay, I'm going to write this thing. I'm going to write it in what I imagine would be 6 episodes. And each episode is going to be this, like, from one character's point of view. And we'll see, it's not a TV series, but I kept thinking that would be, like, I could see that, like, I could see myself watching that. And that's what you always want with anything. I mean, you sit with a novel for a whole year. You don't want to be bored by it. And so I thought to myself, I could see that being turned into a TV series, and I could also see it being a really interesting way of telling the story.
It's funny because I had a follow-up about because I also like to sound really high-minded and pretentious, and so I had a follow-up question about Akutagawa's original short story called In a Bamboo Grove, published in 1915, which is the Rashomon framework, but we're going to skip that. I had to reread it. Actually, when I finished this, I went back and reread it because you made me so excited about the form again that it blew me away. But and the same, it's funny because the same thing happens with both Kurosawa's film and Akutagawa's story, which is the end, which I won't spoil, comes from a completely unexpected source. Was that a happy accident or was that planned?
Oh yeah, so the end, I don't want to talk much about the end.
Which is why I brought it up at the beginning.
I will say that the end is, I'm really proud of the end of this novel. And like, it's a nice surprise for the reader. So if you want to have that nice surprise, do not go on Goodreads and read any reviews of this book, because everyone seems to want to give away the end. But the end was, this is what I'll say about the end. The end was inevitable when I discovered it. I cannot remember when I discovered it, but when I did discover it, I was like, oh yes. And when I handed it in, I was nervous about my editor reading the end. And my editor was like, I'm not so sure about this. However, I said, we're doing it. And people who like the book really like the end. So I think I got it right.
Publishing is funny like this. There's an element in closing costs that I thought for sure my agent was going to fight me on. And he didn't. And then I thought for sure my editor was going to fight me on. And then she didn't. And I still can't believe it made it into the book because it's so weird. But it's nice when that happens.
You'll have to tell me about that after.
Oh, it's a great story. Okay, so we've invented the universe. Let's talk about the crust of our pie. Moving down to the planet, where does Monreath come from?
Oh yeah, so it's set in this town that's made up. I've learned through hearing from readers not to use real places, because you never ever get them right, especially if you're using small places, because you can really mess up a small place very easily. So I decided to make up a town. So I took 3 towns that already exist. Duxbury, where I grew up. Anyone who has been to Duxbury will see certain things there, like the beach and the bridge that goes over the bay and some of the big houses. And I took the downtown of Plymouth, which is a nice big Main Street downtown. I plunked it right in the middle of the town. And then I set it all down on the south coast of Massachusetts instead of on the South Shore. And so I took a lot of my friend the West Peering's Westport, which is more bucolic. It's more like Duxbury when I was growing up, when Duxbury was more bucolic. So I wanted to sort of harken back to the way Duxbury used to be.
Is there any influence from the actual Monreath in Scotland, or is that another coincidence?
No. I was looking for the name of a town that didn't exist in Massachusetts, and so I often will do this. I just kind of went along the coast of the UK until I found a town that didn't exist, and that was the name. That was the extent of my.
I mean, this is a story that could only take place in a small town. It seems to me, given the intertwined nature of the relationships between such a large cast of characters. But the other thing that suggests to me is that the town is not just a setting, but also a kind of character in the story. So what responsibility does the town have for what happens?
Oh, a lot. I mean, it's a small town where everyone knows everyone, right? And if you've ever grown up, if you have ever lived in a small town like that, it's a unique way of living. And one of the things I wanted to do with this story was explore a little bit about. So when I was growing up, my dad was the principal at a high school, which is it's just an interesting, unique way of growing up, right? And one of the things that when you're the principal or you're the principal's son is that you're a member of the community, but you also sort of sit up over the community a little bit because you have this managerial position with people's kids. And so I kind of wanted to explore that relationship with a small community and what that is like. So if you look at each of the POV characters in this novel, they all have a sort of a unique view into the community. So the first one is a psychiatrist. He's not very ethically minded, but he works with people in the town. And like the central question that started the whole novel, it sort of was a carryover from my prior novel, was like, what do you do if you're a therapist in a small town and you're like being a social person, like you must run into your clients all the time. So like, what do you do? And then like the secondary question was, what do you do if you're not ethically minded? So, and then I went, that's where the whole story kind of came from. But then there's a minister, there's a police officer, there's even a car mechanic. A car mechanic is going to get a little view into people's lives. He's going to be able to see people's financial lives in a little way that most people wouldn't have. So that's how I sort of incorporated the town.
There we go. I'm so glad I live in the greater metro area because I never run into my therapist. But so, well, you sort of naturally segue into the next part of the pie, which is the filling, which I think of as the characters. They're the flavor of the whole story. So, and you also mentioned Farley, the psychiatrist. You in the novel you refer to him as the shrink. Let's start there. Farley is very unlikable. Why did you start the story with someone that would put the reader on such a defensive posture?
I wanted people to feel very unsettled almost from the start. So Farley, it was funny because my first beta reader that I gave it to, she was sort of taking notes in the margins as she was reading it. And she was like, she couldn't tell whether Farley was a man or a woman at first, but she's like, I like this character. And like 2 pages later, she was like, maybe not so much. And then a few pages later, she's like, I don't like him at all. And I was like, that's sort of exactly what I wanted. I wanted the reader to sort of like feel very unsettled right from the start. And because of the way the novel's told, again, only 1/6 of the novel is told from Farley's point of view. I almost wanted to. How am I going to say this? I almost wanted it to come as a relief that you came to the end of the Farley chapter and you could kind of see the characters from a different point of view.
And as soon as the next section is revealed from their point of view, you're like, oh, thank God, I don't have to be in this guy's head anymore.
Yeah. But I mean, Farley is like lovably awful, I think.
Farley has, it's funny because I want to bring up clear parallels that I see in the character of Farley, but I feel like it might be giving too much away to mention them. So I'll say I've seen Farley in other works of literature, or at least Farley-like characters. But you did give us a certain reprieve in not making the entire novel his point of view, because it's uncomfortable to be in his head.
Yeah.
But now at the same time, and you mentioned it earlier in your introduction, most of the people in this town are uncomfortable and have their issues. So I guess is it the case that you sort of used him at the beginning to set the tone for the novel so that the rest of the cast seemed less off-putting?
I don't know. I mean, the way
is he a comparison?
Yeah, I mean, for the way that the novel's structured, the novel can only be structured the way the novel's structured because of who tells what part of the story when. And so it's important for Farley to tell the first sixth of the novel, because only he can tell that first sixth of the novel, and it has to end, like his story has to end when his story ends. And so much of the novel really came down to so there's an overarching story. It begins from A, it goes from A to Z, but because we're telling it in the way that we're telling it, you in the first section you might go from A to M, and then in the second section you start at A and you might go to a little bit past M, and then you might start at C and you go to Z or whatever. But the way all of the pieces fall together as the novel comes together, they had to be told in the very specific order that they were told, regardless of whether we liked people or not.
But that's where their pin on the big conspiracy thread chart appears, like over here, and then it leads to this.
Yeah.
Gotcha. So yeah, no, that was interesting because I know when I'm reading a really good book that I stop reading it like a writer and start reading it like a reader, and that's exactly how I had the experience with this. I was just like, oh yes. But there were moments where I started to kind of fall in love with the structure that you were doing and wondering how you did it, like a magician doing a trick. Like, how did he just make that coin disappear?
Well, I keep trying to remember how I did it. This was like a big headache, a big year-long headache, as all of the pieces were sort of falling in place. But again, some things would surprise me, and other things I knew from the start. Like I knew who did it at the end. I knew who. I knew what crimes each character had committed, but then there'd be these little things that would really surprise me. Like the vast majority of the novel takes place at a birthday party, so there's a birthday cake, and the birthday cake started taking on significance just because it kept getting mentioned, and I was like, you can't mention something that often in a novel and not have it mean something.
Chekhov's cake.
Yeah. Anyway, so there's like this cake, and. So finally I thought to myself, so for a while, this isn't giving too much away, but Alice is one of the characters, and she's having a birthday party, and she's done all the planning for it herself, but she wants her husband Damien to bring the cake, but she doesn't want to have to tell him to bring the cake. So that's the whole story, right? And so she's like, okay, I want this cake there. Alice is going to Farley, that's her therapist, and she's like, I want him to bring this cake tonight to this party. And it's got to be a carrot cake, and it's got to have walnuts and raisins in it. And so Alice, her whole character not her whole character, but that cake helps define her because she wants the cake. And then her husband, Damien, he's supposed to deliver the cake. So his character is defined because he's supposed to deliver the cake, and guess what? The cake isn't delivered. So then, as I was writing, I got to the final section, and I kept thinking about the cake, and I was like, how can I add an extra, like, I've mentioned this cake so many times, how can I make it satisfying to the reader that they've had to sit here and endure all these mentions of this cake? And so I added another twist, and there's another character that I don't want to tell you what happens with the cake.
Don't tell.
There's another character who has something to do with this cake, and it gives everything new meaning for the characters, for just those three characters, not all of them.
That moment, I was just like, yes, the cake! Like, for real, I don't think I've ever read a book before where I was rooting for the cake. But this one was just like, oh my God, what? That kind of floored me in terms of all of the surprise sort of reveals in this book. That a baked good was the one that really like made me like stand up and shout.
Those are the most fun ones as a writer, though, because you don't plan them, and they just kind of come out of nowhere, and you're like, oh, it was sort of there the whole time, and you just didn't know, you just didn't see it was there.
It's such a slap, though. It's great. It's because I've written a couple of books that had complicated timelines, not as complicated as this, and they drove me insane. Like I'm a big outliner, and so I usually have like a long. When I'm writing a book, I'm writing a brand new book right now, and I'm about 20 pages into the outline that will allow me to start writing this book. Right? That's how I work. And I wrote this book with these multiple timelines and a cast of dozens and all this stuff, and I thought I was going to go insane because I had to have multiple timelines and all these character relationships, and it drove me insane. And then I read this, and I was like, oh yeah, no, that was nothing. Thanks. So let's talk about the characters in particular. So there's a lot of interesting people in this small town, but between the shrink and the documentary filmmaker and another character that I won't mention because I think it's too big of a spoiler. But are these people that you know, are these real people from your life? How did you come up with the members of the town?
Oh my God, I write about like the worst people in the world, so they're not real at all.
Damn it!
Like, I mean, I do talk to like Joe, who's right here, helped me out because this was a fun thing actually. So I have watched plenty of TV. Let's put it that way. So I've seen therapists in action on TV. And the way I normally develop characters is I just sort of base what I know. I write the first draft and I try and figure out what the character would do and what they would do in their profession. And then if I really don't know what I'm talking about, I go to someone who does know about therapy. So one of the fun things that I learned, which I know you probably already know this, but I learned that if you are a therapist and a patient discloses to you that they have murdered someone, you are not allowed to tell anyone. You can only tell someone if they threaten to kill someone in the future. And so I'd written the novel like this person could disclose. And it was like such a fun thing to learn. And what a great dilemma to give Farley, who has already proven to be ethically challenged, for him to know something about this character, for him to know that someone might be murdering someone. So that was really exciting. And then I also talked to a couple of Unitarian ministers and to find out what their day-to-day lives are like. And it was really interesting because there was one who was like really kooky and sort of like really laughed at herself the whole time, and one who took the job very, very seriously. So I sort of took aspects of both of them. So I guess like what the only thing that I took from real life people were things that they do at their job, not things that they do in this novel.
Gotcha.
Yes.
I wasn't sure if you were working out something with a former boss, or, as we do. I had a novel where I had to have 16 guys in it, and I needed 16 names, so I just named them all after the boys in my son's preschool class. And then someone figured it out. I did terrible things to those men. It was like, so, I'm always interested in where the people come from. So, speaking of the people, and the way that the title dovetails with their lives. So, you've told a Rashomon tale, but it's kind of different than your traditional Rashomon tale, which is the idea in Kurosawa and the original story is that you have several people who are talking about the same event and they have different perceptions of what happened. But in the novel, it seems like almost everyone has a pretty accurate or a pretty truthful telling of the events that are going on. So they're not so much unreliable narrators as they're unreliably honest with themselves. Was that also intentional to sort of shift the focus from the sort of the how do I want to say it, the subjectivity of perception to the subjectivity of self-perception?
Yeah, I did. I will say when I first tried it, there are 6 narrators, and I did try to do a little bit more of the Rashomon style, where it's really about perception, and it actually was so confusing to read. And I thought, I am the author, and I'm getting confused by this thing. So I wound up taking a little bit of that, most of that out, and really wanted to hone to the truth, so that each character is being really sort of very honest with the reader. There aren't. In fact, it's funny. A lot of the reviews will say that there are 6 unreliable narrators. So I'm like, no, they're not. They're all telling the truth. You may not want to hear what they have to say, but
But they're not being honest with themselves.
No, of course not.
Right, because they all see themselves as the hero of the story and have good motivations, but very few of them actually do.
Yeah. That was the fun part about this, right? So you're staying with each character for about 50 pages or so, and you're really getting what their perception of the world is and what their perception of their place in that world, and they all have a pretty skewed view of that perception.
The original story is only 10 pages long, And it's a hard read because
Yeah.
because every time it's a half page and then you start over and you reread the same thing but from a completely different point of view. But it's not just a point of view; it's a completely different set of events, and you're putting it together. So yeah, I can't imagine trying to do it at a novel length, but you did it. So does this story have any heroes?
Yes.
All right. This is a lesson I should have retained from law school, which is ask open-ended questions.
I think there are 3 heroes in
Okay.
this novel.
You don't have to name them, but what I want to know is, are there any characters in this book, and this is sort of a form of who's your favorite child? Are there any characters in this book that you really, really felt like you wanted to spend more time with them? This was where your heart was in the book.
Oh yeah, I mean, there's one character who has to make a tragic decision at late in the novel, and I really think that character is the very heart of the novel. I can't say much more.
Yeah, no, it's hard to say. Like we can't give details, but yeah, it's funny because there are a couple of characters that I feel like when I was reading it spoke to me with a kind of emotionality that other characters lack. Well, Farley is Farley. He's just such an amazing dick, and so you don't really get to have much affection for him. But there are other characters that are just so wonderful, and you want to be with them. And I was wondering if that was sort of an expression of how you felt about them. It was. So we've talked about the universe. We've talked about the crust. We've talked about the filling. Let's talk about the flavor. And it seems to me that the flavor in any kind of mystery suspense kind of thing is conflict. In this case, it comes down to violence. Because of the way this book is written, the violence happens off screen. It's discovered later. It's not present. And for me as a writer, I have to find the emotional weight of violence. I have to lean into lingering in that moment. How hard was it for you as a writer to take a step back and approach violence after the fact, after the body's cool?
I mean, I would say my first novel, which Monica interviewed me about 5-6 years ago, was violent, and violent in a way that I'm like less comfortable with now, and so I often will just write about the violence. I do often write the violence and then cut it out, but I don't write about much sex and I don't write about much violence. All that I make
This book is horny.
I'm a fade to black person. But no, I mean, I think for me, novels are mostly about the motion of decision and the consequences of decisions. And so whether the violence is there or not, the consequence is there. And I think that's the thing that I really want to explore.
If you feel comfortable talking about it, what was the moment between the first Hester Thursby novel, which is violent, on the page, and this novel where you feel like you're not quite comfortable writing that anymore? What was the tipping point?
Oh, I don't know. I think it's just like my, I don't know. I think it's just how I evolved as a storyteller.
Oh, okay, all right, that makes sense.
Yeah.
Because I do notice a distinct difference in the tone of those two novels. The most recent and the first.
And I will say my editor's always like, bring in more violence. And I'm like, no, I don't really want to. So, yeah.
Excellent. So, all right, we'll do. We've done the universe. We've done the crust. We've done the filling, the flavor. We're gonna have one last bite before I think we need to probably open it up. Well, we're a little early for questions, but we can see what we do. I can't remember which bio. I think it's the bio on your webpage. You talk about taking month-long vacations and watching old horror movies on VHS, and I have to ask. There's a detail in the book that has to do with croquet violence, and is that a direct homage to Stephen King's The Shining?
Oh, maybe a little bit. When I was writing, so there's a big croquet
in
game.
the book.
Yep. I was thinking more of Heather's when I was writing that. I don't know if it's an homage, but I definitely was thinking about Heathers when I was writing
I
it.
totally missed the Heathers
Yeah.
moment, but it makes perfect sense.
But I did, like in my first book, there was an homage to The Shining in that. So maybe I've had more than one now that I think about it.
It's deep
Yeah.
in your consciousness.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes.
It's like there's a reference to The Shining in every Pixar movie. It's true.
Oh, I'll have to look for those now.
Yeah, it's the carpets and the names of the numbers on doors and everything. Yeah, it's great.
Yeah.
All right. So, well, I'll tell you what this book did to me, and this is it. So normally, like I said, I've got all these flags. I've got marginalia. I don't wreck books. I wrecked this book. I was like, oh my God, is this it? Did he do it? It can't be him. I hate this. Right? So yeah, no, you really got me.
Thank you. Thank you.
So now we've finished the pie, and we're sitting in our moment of sort of stuffed contentedness, and I'm already thinking about what's for dinner tomorrow. So what are you working on next?
Oh my gosh, I've been working on this book that's like killing me. And it has been killing me for a little while now, but it's about a guy who solves a crime with a former star of a Law and Order type TV show. They start solving a crime, and she had made an episode of her show about a crime that happened to his family. So they both look at the crime that happened when he was a kid, when she was younger, and then they're solving a present-day crime together as well. And then there's this one I don't fade to black, because there is a May-December romance in it. I think that's why I'm struggling with it.
Is it easier to write sex or violence?
Oh, violence. Violence.
That is correct. We're into the lightning round portion of the interview.
Yes.
So, Kirk or Picard? Kirk or Picard?
Oh, Picard.
Wrong. Paul Tripoli's better at that. He's always better at that. It's funny that you mentioned it's harder to write violence than it is sex, and I totally agree. And I'm not sure why that is, because I'm much less familiar with violence.
Mm-hmm.
But for some reason, it's easier to write on the page. Maybe it's the American Puritan kind of thinking about it. Is any part of that related to your identity as a gay man, and these characters being, so a couple of these characters being gay as well? Does that make it complicated, or is it just what it is?
No, I mean, so there are a couple, I explore sexuality in this novel, and that was sort of fun to write, actually. I hadn't done, I guess I had done gay characters before, but it was fun to have, two central characters who were gay and in a couple, to sort of, one of the things I wanted to do with Farley, who's gay, I wanted to sort of explore, the narcissism of the gay community, which I think I kind of got across.
Yeah.
So anyway, so yeah, I think that was, but again, there's not a lot of sex even between those two.
But I did really appreciate Farley, because he's an objectionable person. There's talk in genre and in the discourse about the traditional sort of what do I want to say, queering of villains in media. So you think about the villain in Silence of the Lambs is maybe not a trans person, and the same Psycho also has a conflicted a character with a conflict about their own identity, and so there's a lot of talk about whether or not it's a good idea to make reprehensible or bad characters gay, because there's been so much of it, and is it?
Oh, I was delighted to do it.
You were delighted. Yeah.
Absolutely delighted.
I love it. I mean, that's where I fall on this. It's like, why can't they? If you
no,
can do
no,
anything,
no.
why can't you be
can
awful?
do anything.
Yeah.
Yep. Yep.
All right. So I think we're pretty close to. We're within a couple of minutes. So if we want to open up the floor to questions, if anybody out there has something they want to ask. Yeah.
Brilliant book. I just finished it this afternoon. I enjoyed your structure and the character viewpoint so very much. I've lived in Massachusetts for about 20 years, And whenever I venture into some of the smaller towns, I find the people there very uptight, mostly. I mean, you don't know them intimately, but the superficial view of it. So I suppose I really have to get to know people living in Duxbury well, because I had to make like notes as to which characters were not in this vortex of desire and sexuality. It was so amazing, but then it's a little disappointing to then go in real life to these towns and see that the characters are nothing like that. So tell me about Duxbury.
Well, I grew up in Duxbury, which was a very small bucolic town, and then in the 70s it grew in population, and now it's is anyone here from Duxbury? It's a very, very, very fancy, wealthy town. It used to be sort of like a beach town. So that's sort of one of the things that I wanted to explore in this, not too heavily, but I wanted to look at sort of how these towns have evolved and how they've changed over time. But I mean, you should explore Duxbury. It's a very beautiful place. They have a beautiful beach.
But I mean, the finger was just put perfectly right on New England provincialism, right? And it's interesting because in the book you do have a character who from outside, whose name I constantly have to look up because it's such a wonderfully soap opera name, Brock London. Oh yes. Yeah. Well, he's a detective in the book. So how did you come up with Brock London?
Well, Brock London is the only character who is a carryover from my previous novel. So Brock, if anyone has read The Secrets We Share, he was the state detective who sort of comes in the last third of the novel to help with the investigation because you needed a state detective there. And so one of the things that the woman he winds up marrying from that novel, she always said his name seemed fake. And so anyway, with this novel, since it wasn't set in Boston, I couldn't use any of my characters from my other books. But because Brock is a state detective, I thought, well, he can drive on down to Monreath and do some investigating. But yeah, so his name is actually a running joke.
Anyone else? Anyone else? Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know if I to read your book, but I didn't know if I heard correctly that it was based on a short story. Is that right, or did I miss it?
It's. I'll let him answer, but to amplify your question for the internet, she's asking whether she hadn't realized that the book might have been based on a short story. So can you explain?
Just the structure. So the Rashomon movie is based on a short story,
Oh, okay.
and the structure comes from that short story.
Okay, so I think the key to writing both sex and violence is the emotion. And people get hung up on the action of like where the body parts are for both, but it's actually the emotion. And related to that, Right Around Box today was all about how what readers really want when they go to a book is emotion. What emotion do you want readers to take away from this?
Oh, sure. So the question is, what emotion do I want readers to take away from this book? I want a couple of things. I always want humor. I really like to have humorous bits in a novel. Humor is always subjective, of course. So whether you succeed or not is really dependent on the reader. What I wanted this I have to say that I have to answer this without. This goes back to the character that Bracken was asking about earlier, like who the hero of this novel is. I wanted this to be really about, I wanted the reader to understand sacrifice at the end of this novel, because there is a huge sacrifice at this end of this novel for this character, and what it means to sacrifice, and to make a decision that has lasting impact for both that character and frankly all of the characters that we've come to know in the novel.
I think that's such a great question because there's an old canard in writing, which is to write what you know, which of course would prevent us, if we took that very literally, writing any kind of space fantasy, high fantasy with dragons and wizards and whatnot. But the write what you know is to write what you know to be emotionally true in the moment, no matter what it is you're doing. So if it's some kind of space opera with pew pew laser guns, then you need to find some emotional center that drives it. Yeah. So yeah.
I have read it. I
loved it. And I'm wondering how you kept track of that central birthday party conversation. Who was sitting next to whom and talking? Like, did you have a diagram in your office? Like, I just was impressed with how, you know, it made sense to me. I didn't go back and check everything, but how did you keep track of it all and make sure it made sense?
Thank you.
She's asking how we kept track of it all and make sense, especially the birthday party, which is a significant portion of the novel where people are situated, who they're talking to, where they are in the moment. Was it like planning a wedding?
It was a little bit. So again, there's a story arc, right? And whenever I started each new section, I'd have to decide what part of the story was that character going to tell, and what parts were going to be repeated. And so the repeated ones I'd have to be really mindful of. It was annoying because once you changed something in one, you'd have to go figure out what it changed in another one. Or if you changed a line of dialogue that I wanted to keep the same from section to section. For example, I had these anchor pieces of dialogue that were just there the only purpose of them was to sort of orient the reader to where we were. So like there's one time where one character says, "Yo, look at that meat." He's grilling, and there's no purpose to that except for that it's like a short staccato line of dialogue, and it just grounds the reader in where we are, like everyone's on the deck at that point. And so like if I changed, there were other lines like that, if I changed them I'd have to go and figure out where they were. And but it was, I will say, when you're writing a novel, you sit with it all the time, and there's this moment where all of a sudden all the pieces sort of fall into place, and you the reader, the writer, actually know how everything fits together. And with this novel, that was like a really wonderful moment, because once I knew where all of the places, how all the pieces fit together, I would know if they were wrong. And I'd sit in bed and I'd think about them and be like, oh yeah, I have to move that one there and that one there. And it always means, which I'm waiting to get to that with my current manuscript, it means that you're close to the end with the story because you just know it so well. But it took a while to get there with this one.
Let's go here.
When you say I had to move that one there and that one there, are you talking about the order of the 6 things? Like you could have written it exposing the characters in a different order. How did it come to that particular order of the 6 things?
Oh yeah. So the question is, how did it wind up that I was telling this story in the specific order that I was telling it in? Because I knew not all of them, but I knew the major secrets that each of those characters had and how those characters were going to, and so when each character had to reveal their major secrets, and they had to do them in a certain order for it all to sort of lay out. So like at the end of Farley's section, he reveals a huge secret. It's the last sentence of his section, and that could only go there at the end of that section, because if it came later, it just wouldn't have had the same emotional impact. And then Alice, her section comes after his. She asks a big question at the end of her section that echoes back to Farley's section, and without Farley's section, that echo wouldn't have worked. So I hope that helps.
You were talking earlier about structure and how Dennis Lehane talks about writing, knowing A, M, and Z. But so beginning, middle, and end. But did you know all of their secrets before you started writing the novel, or did some of them sort of occur to you as you're moving on?
I knew the big ones, but then like the birthday cake ones, those all came out of nowhere. Yeah.
I just wanted to ask about the characters, the filling, and you're making the development of the characters in the novel. It reminds me of, what was that show about the Irish Dad Sisters? Right, and that's a little bit of a Rashomon as well, because this one sister goes attached to her. You have no idea how she gets it until her story is told, and they tell each story that way. So there's a lot of development of the characters, not just knowing what their secret is, but how they're going to communicate with everybody else and what's the interaction between them. How much of that did you develop in advance before writing?
Oh, almost none.
So that's the fun part.
Can you repeat the question?
So how much of the, how am I going to phrase what you just said? How much of each
of the characters' personalities?
Oh yeah, how much of the personalities did I develop? No, actually that's not true. If I could have summed up each of the characters in like a sentence at the beginning, but I couldn't have summed them up in any more depth than that. So I sort of, what their character motivation is, like what do they dream of or what do they dread? And then you look at how the plot, like when you're structuring a novel, you figure out what the character wants, and then you figure out how the plot is keeping them from getting what they want. So I knew the answer to that. And then their character sort of evolves out of how they respond to the plot and how they respond to not getting what they want.
It's like 12 Angry Men was developed the other way. Here are the characters, they're all, each one represents a Jungian personality type. Now let's throw them in a room.
Yeah.
So how much work above and beyond this is what they want and this is what's keeping them from getting that do you do in character development ahead of time, or do they?
I do it all through the
they
writing
develop
process
as you write it?
Yeah.
So Edwin, I follow you on social media, and I read that you said this was your most personal novel.
Yes.
So I'm really curious to hear more about that. Like, how is it personal to you? 'Cause it's a brilliant intellectual endeavor, and I read it in a day. As I told you, it's really amazing. The characters are so well developed in each of the perspectives. I love it. But it's fascinating to me because I read all of your books. So I want to hear, how is this one more personal to you?
Sure. So the question is, I had said on social media, this is my most personal novel. There are a couple things here. So the personal parts are the setting. I mean, the town that I grew up in is very central to this story. This idea of being on the outside looking in, which a lot of these characters are doing in this novel, that was sort of a part of making it very personal. And again, sort of that idea of my dad being the principal of the high school was a big part of my development. And it's just an interesting view on the world, and to be part of a community, and to sit over the community is just an interesting way of existing, especially when the community is that small.
Were you a good kid or a troublemaker?
I think I was mostly a good kid, but I could make trouble.
Because I see the archetype exactly like the priest's kid or the cop's kid. The principal's kid is either going to try to get away with everything or never step out of line.
Yeah, I was mostly not never stepping out of line.
Mostly.
Yeah.
We've got time for 2, maybe 3 more questions if there are any. Yeah.
How much time or how much thought did you put into the idea of making their voices sound different on the page?
So the question is, how much thought did I put into making their voices sound different on the page? A lot. The success of the novel really hinges on them not sounding exactly alike. And that actually, now that you mentioned that, I just remembered that was part of the order too. So I wanted to have especially at the beginning when I was setting up the rules of the novel, I wanted to have it be a man and then a woman, just so that there'd be a clear distinction there. But yeah, no, I tried to give them all different tics. I tried to make, as you're moving from one character to the next, to make it very clear that new character was someone different and new, especially in that very first chapter that you're telling the new section from. I think it's really important to establish that voice there.
What was the Shining reference in Little Comfort?
Oh, the Shining reference is when, if anyone remembers, Hester lives in this crazy apartment where the upstairs attic has this tiny little door where you can get into the other apartment, and so she has to shove Kate through the door, but she herself cannot fit, much like Wendy could not fit out the window when he was chopping down the door.
What was my question? I have a question about uncanniness, because I feel like there's a difference between horror, thriller, and then this feeling of uncanny. And I was wondering, as a writer, why would you recommend someone go about that? For context, I'm doing my first foray into like horror.
Yeah.
What advice do you have?
To be uncanny?
Yeah, like how do you write that just feeling of unsettling?
Oh. Yeah. Okay. So there's this. How do you create this feeling of unsettling? So there's this concept of a story question, and so a story question is really easy to understand. A story question is just a question you're asking as the novel goes forward, and sometimes you'll answer a story question right away. You ask, will Edwin ever finish this sentence? And then you answer it in the very next chapter. And then sometimes you ask a story question, you answer it maybe in that act. And then other times you'll, like with a murder mystery, the question is who murdered whoever. And you don't answer that till the end. And so a good way to unsettle the reader is to answer the questions, but to answer them in ways that surprise them, right? And so in this novel, there are a series, like in this novel, in the Farley section, there are a series of little surprises that happen, especially in the first 4 chapters, where we quickly learn that Farley makes very poor decisions in his professional life. And each of them is presented, the question is presented and then answered very quickly. One author who does this really, really well, who lives around here, is called Peter Swanson. So Peter will pose a question that an entire novel can be about, and then he answers it right away, in the very next chapter, and constantly ratchets up that tension.
I think part of horror in particular, and creating something that's uncanny, is like humor. If you're telling a joke, the joke is funny because it reveals something that's transgressive, that wasn't the answer you were expecting. And the same thing is true of horror. Is you set up this question, but the answer transgresses somehow what the expectation or what the right answer would be. And in order to, I think, really to find a fit that's uncanny as opposed to just horror or gross out or whatever, that transgression has to be so deeply rooted in reality. You have to have a really solid framework, and then you can say, but this is wrong. I think the best example of the uncanny that I've seen recently was the newest season of True Detective. Everything about that show, has this moment, this feeling of reality. Here's a real setting. It's an alien setting because it's the Arctic. But then there are these great moments of perfect transgression, like a severed tongue on the floor. And I know I made that guy stop before he left the building. I'm so sorry, sir. Which is completely transgressive and out of character, and it makes you stop and go, oh no, there's something deeply wrong. So I think we might be out of time. So thank you so much, Edwin. Thank you, everyone.